Welcome to the interview series. The interview series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number one, weekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Douglas Bauer. Douglas Bauer's forthcoming novel, The Beckoning World, will be published in the fall 2022. He is the author of three previous novels, Dexterity, The Very Air, and The Book of Famous Iowans, and three works of nonfiction, Prairie City, Iowa, 3 Seasons at Home, The Stuff of Fiction, Advice on Craft, and What Happens Next, Matters of Life and Death, which won the Penn New England Award in Nonfiction. He is also the editor of the anthologies Prime Times, Writers on Their Favorite TV Shows, and Death by Pad Thai and Other Unforgettable Meals. His numerous essays, reviews, and articles have appeared in Esquire, Harper's, The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, the Los Angeles Book Review, and many other publications. He has won grants from the National Endowment for the Arts in both fiction and creative nonfiction. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and teaches at Bennington College, where he is a core faculty member of the Bennington Writing Seminars MFA program in Writing and Literature. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So today we'll be looking at Chapter 9 from The Beckoning World, which is coming out on the University of Iowa Press. I thought we could start simply by discussing what your normal composition process is.
Well, it depends a little bit on what it is I'm composing, whether something longer or the opposite. But you know what it always has in common, no matter what I'm writing, is a long time of note taking. That I always think of the notebook that I keep and kind of try to refine the ideas I'm working on as notes toward a first draft. And it's from that body of notes that get ideally gradually ever more defined and refined before I move from the notebook to the computer. If I'm writing a longer piece, if I'm working on a novel, I like to have I wouldn't call it an outline, but I need to have a general sense of the sequence of events that are subject to change as the writing proceeds. I certainly don't have anything really rigorous as an outline, and I only have the vaguest idea of how it concludes, which again sometimes changes. But it's a very kind of, I try to ease into it as much as I can through those stages, I think.
So can you talk a little bit about how it might change as the story goes?
Well, sure. I remember once I was in an audience where the wonderful story writer Grace Paley was speaking, and in answer to a question, she spoke of her characters as her employees. And I love that notion of having your characters work for you as employees. But they have, ideally they have independence and they have frames of mind and energy that you have only limited control over. So in the simplest terms, you find yourself wanting them to do things in furtherance of the story that you originally didn't think of. And, you have to, I anyway, have to have the freedom to let that happen. Um, I, I don't believe I don't believe in the idea that, you know, the imagination is an exalted thing and you just sit there and let the muse talk to you. Um, and I've always been a little suspicious of that notion. But so I do try to keep control in a certain loose way. But as I said, I'm repeating myself. There are times when you find that what you originally thought would work, it might work, but in the course of letting these characters evolve, particularly if they're in conflict or in some sense of partnership, um, you find that other things that happen in your head make for better action on the page.
Indeed. Yes, so we're going to look at an excerpt from chapter 9. And since it's chapter 9, I was hoping you could provide a brief summary of the book so that our viewers can get a sense of what's happening.
Sure. I'll try to be brief. It's a complicated story. So the two main characters in the story are Earl Dunham and Emily Marchand, who fall in love and eventually marry, but not without complication. Earl is the main character, really. He is the protagonist of the novel. And he, at a certain point in their very young lives, they're 19, 20 years old, he meets Emily, where she's working in a diner in Waterloo, and he's immediately taken with her, and they begin to court. Earl is a minor league baseball player. He's pitching for the Waterloo team in the 3I League, which was a real league, and his ambition, his great dream, is to be a major league baseball pitcher. Emily finds that as much as she loves Earl, she simply cannot imagine herself as in that life for all of its uncertainties. And so they have a real argument and a parting and agree to meet after a month to kind of talk things through and see where they each is at that point. So chapter 9 is this meeting where they see each other again after having been separated and not in communication at all for a little more than a month. Thanks. So that's the context of this chapter. And what I'm going to read now is my first draft or early version of this chapter, just a couple of paragraphs of it. He reached for her hands, then stood, and she rose with him from her chair. He led her to the middle of the lobby where there was all the room they needed, and she moved into his arms. As they began to dance, he asked, "Where were you?" "When?" "Just now, before I said your name." She only shook her head and asked him to hold her more tightly, and they were silent, moving nearly in place, until she said into his chest, "At night, I love to stand on the porch and trace the constellations, but I'm no good at it. I can never trace the bull. I can never find the sword." "What made you think of that?" "I have to remember, to tell myself some things will still be there." In a breathy echo of a voice, nostalgia already in it. "If you say no, I can still stand on the porch and not find Taurus and Orion." Earl nodded, his chin lightly brushing the top of her head. He looked to the front of the lobby where the three rough-whiskered men were passed out in their chairs. They were utterly still, these men, their faces blank as legumes. They were babes in a nursery in need of baths and shaves. The song, they didn't believe me, was their lullaby. Earl thought, why does it do that to him, the booze? He thought, why couldn't it turn him dumb and quiet? But he considered if it did, he, Earl, might have still been there or not have left in time to find her, their lives crossing as they had. he would not have been here dancing with this woman who took solace in the thought of looking vainly for Orion.
Thank you.
Sure.
So there are a number of large changes between this early draft and the later draft. And perhaps the biggest change is that both Earl and Emily are given equal standing in their feelings. That is, in the earlier draft, Earl is kind of situated as the spurned partner, wondering how Emily can ask him to give up so much to live with her and her parents on the farm. And this seems crucial to me when considering the character of Earl later in the story. How did you recognize and revise towards this?
See, when I was originally thinking of them and this very anxious meeting, because Earl is usually the focus of a chapter or an event, and we're usually in Earl's head primarily. I think, by that point in the drafting of the novel, I had just frankly gotten in the habit of occupying Earl's head, not at the expense of anyone else necessarily, but instead of anyone else. And I think my first draft, just kind of followed from the habit that I'd been developing as I was writing the novel. And as I revised it, I realized, and I have to say, this was much more unconscious on my part than anything that I just sort of pinpointed and said, aha, I have to make this change. But I did realize on some level that the anxiousness, the stakes, the high stakes, were every bit as much Emily's as Earl's. Her future was on the line. What she was going to say in this meeting and what she was going to try to explain to Earl and present to Earl, that was every bit as important to the chapter, to the story, as Earl's own agenda. So there was an equality about that for me. And I think on revision, as I say, not so much out of a conscious identification, but really as I was just kind of maybe getting not more sympathetic to Emily, but more familiar with Emily. I just kind of naturally moved back and forth between them in the revised chapter.
Yeah, there's also another major edit. In the part that you just read, there were three rough whiskered men, and those men have been drinking in this hotel lounge. Um, they are absent in the later draft. And I was curious to know why you removed them. Did you think they weren't accomplishing something in the earlier draft?
Well, actually, in a way, I felt they were accomplishing too much in that they were a diversion, which I quite deliberately created and placed. And I think I'm sometimes, as a fiction writer, I'm sometimes tempted to overpopulate my scenes, just for the sport of it. Just kind of what else can be going on here in this moment? Who else can be in this frame of vision? And when I saw these three kind of rowdy guys sitting around and drinking from their flask, I thought, well, that could be fun to kind of juxtapose them and what they're doing and some of the things they say with the main action of Earl and Emily's conversation. But it seemed very clear to me on revision that they were diverting. They took the energy away to an extent from Emily and Earl's conversation. There were times when very important moments were about to be articulated by either Emily or Earl, and the narration cut away from them and went to the rough whiskered men or to something else. And so that just seemed a big mistake to me. Revision, in fact, not only in this chapter, but for the novel, I would say generally, was mostly a matter of making it tighter, leaner, more efficient as storytelling, just pairing it and keeping that energy really focused on what seemed to me by far more important matters. There's another in the original early version. These two hotel clerks appear carrying a Victrola into the lobby, and there's even a bit of byplay with them. And I thought on revision, why do there need to be two? And why does there need to be that kind of repartee? So I took one of them away. Just had one clerk taking them, and so just stuff like that. But the rough whiskered men were the best example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting, I think, is right. We always talk about details being important in stories, so that the reader can feel like they're in the room, that they're at the scene.
Right.
Um, but then on the other hand, right, there can be too many details that slow down what's happening or don't really matter to the story. And so like it's that idea of how do I insert and take out what is really necessary to a particular story. And I also have been thinking a little bit about, right, this is set in the past, right, when Victrolas were still a newer invention. And so it actually was like a big thing to have music playing, especially without like a pianist or something
Right.
within the hotel lobby.
Right.
And so, these different things come into play. And so how do you think about, well, I want this to be true to life, and true to the interruptions that happen in life, but also focus on the story. That seems like a hard thing for younger writers maybe to figure out.
Well, it is hard, I don't know that it ever gets easier. At least it doesn't get easier for me. And I would say, if you have the impulse to think discursively in your imagination, particularly in early drafts, early versions of what you're writing, go with it, because you can always take it out. And it's much hard for me anyway. It's much harder to add as I'm revising, as opposed to paring back. So I wouldn't discourage someone from just kind of letting your impulses take you when you're originally conceiving that scene that you described so well, Matthew, in saying, you want it to be life. You want the reader to forget that this is artificial. You want that reader to be in that room, and it's only, for me, it's only natural to just give the moment as much as I can possibly think of on first pass. And then, with revision, to put a very unsparing eye on it and try to work as editor, and to see what really matters. And I'm a tremendous devotee, advocate, a fan of Charles Dickens, and I always think of his scenes and just how raucous they are, so many of them, and wildly populated. But if you look at Dickens' scenes closely, you'll find that the key players are not that many. He focuses on one or two key characters in a vividly rendered scene where there's all kinds of stuff going on in the background. And I think the rough whiskered men were not sufficiently in the background. If I could have found perhaps a way to make them just, more ornamental, but importantly so, I might have kept them. But they were too interruptive. As I say, they just took the energy and the attention away from what I thought was really important, which was the conversation between Earl and Emily.
Yeah. So speaking of the conversation, there is a fair amount of dialogue. Some of it is in direct quotations, some is imagined by one character or the other, and some of it is narrated. And the attribution, if I'm correct, even switches between Earl and Emily in slight ways between the two drafts.
You're right.
Um, how do you think about pacing in conjunction with dialogue and determining how best to convey that particular material?
Mm. Well, I think a lot about dialogue, and for me, dialogue is the most delicious aspect of writing fiction. Um, I think one of the reasons I gravitated more toward fiction from nonfiction, where I started, was I remember when I was writing my first book, a nonfiction book, Prairie City, Iowa, which you mentioned, uh, which was all, true things happened. And there were several moments where I thought, God, if he'd only said this instead of what he actually said, it would have been a much better scene. And so I love to write dialogue. Um, and I actually wrote a whole chapter about dialogue in my craft book, Stuff of Fiction. For me, I think of the reader as an eavesdropper, who's witnessing the scene, who may be very close to the scene, and is trying to hear as much as they can that's going on in the scene. And when dialogue happens in a scene, I envision that reader leaning closer to try to catch not only the sound of what people are saying to each other, but the actual words. So for me, dialogue serves that function of beckoning the reader more closely and really kind of giving it an emphasis to the importance of the moment. The prose, the narrative in a scene is kind of the universe of the scene as you establish it. And the dialogue is the conversation within the universe. And you want the universe, of course, so that the reader is settled and comfortable with, familiar with, not in any kind of adverse relations to the atmosphere. But you also want those moments for sake of just altering the pace and bringing the reader closer. The dialogue serves, I think.
Yeah. Sometimes when I think about writing dialogue, I'll have an idea like started, and then I'll just go dialogue, 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 dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to get that particular moment and feeling down in the dialogue, but I'll forget to pause and like put in anything about the stakes of the dialogue, right? And
Absolutely.
that becomes like one of the hard things for me to be like, oh, it's not just a blank room with two people just talking at each other, right? That's the hard thing I think about dialogue for me.
Well, you hit it on the head, I think, Matthew, because both things are essential. Both components of a scene, those two components are essential. I often um, point out to students, remind the reader where they are. Just give them, just give a line that says, the wind moved the curtains, and then you can go back to dialogue. But it is important to make those key just interruptions, I think, as much as anything else. So yeah, I think you're right. And I also think dialogue for me, it's a matter of rhythm. Dialogue is all about rhythm. It's syncopation. One of my great heroes is Don DeLillo, and if you read him, you will see pages of that look like rungs of a ladder, just dialogue, dialogue, dialogue all down the page. And you can actually, I do this sometimes when I'm reading him. I start to tap my hand to the rhythm of his dialogue, and there is an absolute syncopation to it, which I think is just delightful to try for yourself and also to read. it really compels you, I think.
Yeah, that directness of language just landing on you, definitely.
Yeah, but the rhythm back and forth, it's almost like a call and response when you've got two people talking to each other.
All right, we're going to shift a little bit here. When the chapters in the Beckoning World change or the location changes, there are markers that clearly denote that we are in a different space, we are in a different year, whatever the case may be. And considering this novel incorporates famous people such as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, as well as historically accurate landscapes and phenomena, can you discuss your praxis laying out, researching, and writing a novel? Those notes you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Well, again, it varies depending on how much research I need to do. Um, Two of the three, now four novels I've written are very much set in the past. So there was a tremendous amount of research to do. And I think one of the great things about research, but also one of its perils, is that you can kind of infinitely postpone getting down to the actual writing by saying, "Oh, I just need to learn a little bit more about this and that." I'm often reminded of a wonderful, and I'm paraphrasing, but there's a wonderful quote from E.L. Doctorow, who talked about, and virtually all of his fiction was historical. And he said, think of it as, you're a driver of a car going down an unfamiliar road at night. And in terms of your research, what you need to know is that span between the headlights in the car and how far they project down the road. And as far as you can see, that which the light gives you, that's what you need to know in terms of research. And as the car proceeds, the light will advance and you'll learn more and you'll learn more and more. But the whole idea that you have to have all the way to your destination lit up before you ever start out is a way never to take the trip. So I do try to remember that. It is kind of an instinctive sense of, okay, I've got enough, I got to get going, and knowing full well that you're going to have to pause and learn some other stuff before you can say about it what you need to say. There's a chapter in this novel that takes place in Denver, in a baseball stadium. And I had a very good friend who lives in Denver. And I asked her if she would go to the address where this baseball stadium used to be, it's no longer there, and just take some photos for me and send me so I wanted to see where what the Rocky Mountain background looked like at that particular address. So you can do things like that, but you don't need to really know it until you've arrived at your destination.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. So next we're going to look at the same excerpt from chapter 9, but the revised version, the final version, as it were. And I'll ask you to read that here. You have put in some ellipses and points to denote that there are some paragraphs and things missing.
Yeah, I have, for the sake of space and brevity, and I've tried to make it so that it flowed decently enough. So it's obviously the same lobby, the same two main characters, the same situation in the final version. He reached for her hands, then stood, and she rose with him from her chair. He led her to the middle of the lobby and she moved into his arms. They danced, taking their pantomime steps, and with the music he was hearing all the nights, he'd asked himself why, once his pain had begun to ease, he couldn't have the life he'd had before he met her. And now he heard the answer in his head. because you met her. He said, I imagined you there on the farm. Emily looked up at him and he could read her face for once. He was curious and thrilled. He said, I saw every detail of the place. She said, and how could you do that? You've never seen it. He was reaching for a fancifulness. He sensed that's what they needed now. I just know it. Prove it, Emily said. Well, I pictured a barn on your farm. Is there a barn? Why, yes, there is. And fields. I saw fields where you grow things. Are there fields by any chance? There are. I saw a house with a kitchen, and in the kitchen, a stove. That's amazing, Emily said. I'm a wizard, Earl said. The song had finished some time ago, the lobby sounding with the static of the needle plowing the end grooves. They'd come to a stop, still holding another. A hotel clerk at last appeared and bent down to change the recording. He lifted the arm, the static ended, the lobby going silent. And in the silence, Earl could hear their breathing, which meant their hearts. He could hear their equal hearts.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's I love the fancifulness there, and right, the move to Earl being a wizard by describing general things that almost any farm has, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
But to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, obviously there are no diversions in the final version. There's only one hotel clerk. There are no rough whiskered men. Their attentions are on each other, and when it's not explicitly overt, they're internal, and the energy becomes internal dialogue, or just the interiority of one of them, Earl, so that the energy is, I hope, even greater than it was before, with far fewer people and far less activity, except the two of them.
yeah, no, the intensity was definitely ramped up there because of that reason.
The other thing is, in the earlier version, when she talks about uh, still thinking she could look for constellations that she can never find, it's very abstract. It's very figurative at the end. He wouldn't be here dancing with a woman who could never find Orion, or whatever the line is. And, I remember loving it at the time I wrote it, but it's very figurative. It's very metaphorical. And here, you're inside of them. You're in their hearts, and that seemed where it ought to be.
Yeah, and Emily is concerned with knowing the shape of her world and life with Earl, whereas Earl is more interested in following the feeling he gets from pitching, but he can't stand to be without Emily. And so their uncertainty is on display here. And certainly their backgrounds play a major part in their meeting and courting. There seems to be a difference between a world that beckons and the society in which that world inhabits. What do you focus on when defining characters in their world?
Well, I think I anyway, kind of imagine the character in his or her world almost simultaneously. I can't think of when I've ever hit on the idea for a character who wasn't already occupying some space. The original direction and focus is on the character, but it's in the context of the place that character inhabits. So I think it's almost a simultaneous process of trying to enrich both the character and the environment, the place, at the same time. The character takes prominence, of course, is preeminent, and the place, however influential, for me is secondary, if vital. But the act of discovery, I think, it really goes on, as I say, simultaneously.
Great. So this particular novel has a lot of baseball in it. So I'm
Mhm.
assuming you love baseball. And I'm interested when that love began, how it's changed over time, and if you think baseball actually says something about America since it's called our national pastime.
Well, I don't remember when I didn't love baseball. I mean, when I was a very small boy, I was fortunate to grow up. My mother's family was very large. I was essentially an only child. My younger brother was 9 years younger than I, so my formative first 8 or 9 years were as an only child. But we, I saw my cousins from my mother's family. She was one of 9 children, and we saw them every Sunday. They lived, we all lived fairly close. And particularly a couple of older cousins were phenomenal athletes. And they were also very generous and tolerant in, you know, pitching, throwing the ball to me and letting me hit. And actually, it was whatever sport was in season. But I remember baseball most of all. It's probably the longest season and the easiest one because it's outdoors. Um, Football is too, but it's cold. And so I just started playing baseball when I was very, very young. And I played all the sports in high school, but baseball is the one I was best at. So I was a decent baseball player. I played through high school. And here's another thing about baseball for me. Um, I grew up in the 50s and early 60s, and there was a time when there was a Saturday nationally televised baseball game of the week. And it was on Saturday afternoon. And much too often the Yankees were on because I hated the Yankees. But anyway, the Yankees and whoever they were playing. And for me, I mean, I was absolutely addicted to watching this baseball game of the week. And it sort of, I just kind of was unconsciously informed about a larger world. These were teams that played in some town called Cleveland or Chicago or Detroit. And I would look them up on the map. And for some reason, I became an avid Cleveland Indians fan, and mostly their uniforms, I suppose. But in any case, I just got this sense of a universe through baseball by watching the games and learning about the other teams and the other players. And the other part of the question is, I think baseball does tell us a lot about who we are and I think it tells us more different things now than it did then, unfortunately. I still follow baseball avidly, but it seems to me it's so much more now about commerce and money. And, my heart is continually broken by the Red Sox letting one of their players go for more money elsewhere. And that's much more what the game seems to be under the influence of than it was when I was learning to love it. I still love it a lot. And, I don't mind the pace of it. As the great criticism of it now is it's much too slow for the age we live in. Um, I love the space in between the active moments, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of the authors you cited earlier, DeLillo, uh, his book Underworld, right, begins on this very long baseball scene having to do with a specific ball. Uh,
Yep,
and so I think it's interesting to like look at all the baseball novels kind of throughout the years,
for
uh,
sure.
and how they focus differently or how things change over time.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I take your point. Have you heard of the Savannah Bananas?
I have. Yeah,
A minor league team who is basically trying to make the game as silly and as fun as possible and
yeah,
interact with the crowd. So they'll have hitters, hit on stilts, or every time something happens, the team runs out of the dugout and they do a dance.
Yeah.
Uh, it is an interesting. It seems like there's been a lot of changes in the last decade, even.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The pitchers don't even hit anymore, and so like things have sped up to get the particular game to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Uh, I think perhaps my least favorite thing is when you go to extra innings, you have a runner starting on second base.
That's sacrilege.
Yeah. It's like, why do we want to get this up? We want to see like the battle of the wills, so to speak,
Right.
of the two teams. And if you put a runner on, it changes everything: the pitcher's stance, the defense, the pitches that are thrown. And it's just like, why I want to see the 20 inning game. I love the 20 inning game.
Well, you're preaching to the choir, but we're an ever shrinking population, I'm afraid. I mean, I think as a culture, we're terrified of boredom, by the idea of being bored, by having to provide our own internal sort of motivation to think things and invent things, and that pause, the length of a baseball game, and all the moments when repeatedly nothing is happening, but of course all kinds of things are happening if you love the game and know it a little bit. I think it's, with the idea of taking away that the fear of inaction. And so, yeah, I agree completely. It's funny you mentioned the DeLillo novella, which I love. Underworld as a book, all of it, and the ball makes appearances throughout the book. There's a very long game in my novel, which I frankly, just went to school on with DeLillo's opening chapter of Underworld. I stole it unabashedly, and sort of moving around among characters, and so I'm in great debt to that novella.
So as we've talked about, you've written several books with ties to the Midwest, particularly Iowa. And of course, this is interesting to us as we're based in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
How has the Midwest shaped your life? And has living on the East Coast changed your perception of the Midwest?
Well, I don't know. I think it certainly shaped my work life, the Midwest. And by that, I mean that, my father was a grain farmer, and his father was. So as a kid, I was terrible at farming. I was horrible at it. And I knew very early on this was not what I was going to be. But I loved riding on the tractor, and later on, I loved, driving the tractor. And that whole idea of whatever task you're in the field doing, that you just start at one end of the field and you keep your eye on that row until you get to the other end. And the kind of patience that's required, and the notion of the view of the long road, I think is very much my temperament, my constitution, and it's why I write books. It's why I'm comfortable writing books. Why my gratification can be delayed, and the daily process is gratification as I think about getting to the end of the road. So temperamentally and constitutionally, the Midwest certainly has shaped me. I think in a lot of ways I'm a typical Midwesterner, or at least the cliche of the typical Midwesterner. I'm deferential, I'm courteous. I think I'm very kind of quietly observant, and I think that's a quality that many Midwesterners have. They take in their surroundings and what's going on in them and who is in them, and just kind of store the knowledge for when it can be used. So in all those ways, I think the Midwest has shaped me. I don't know that living on the East Coast has changed my perception of the Midwest. I think maybe it has, only in the sense that, and I'm speaking ignorantly now because I haven't lived in the Midwest for a very, very long time. But it seems to me that culturally, politically, the Midwest has changed from when I lived there. It was always a relatively conservative place, but it seems to have gotten more so. Um, and I find that my own preferences politically, culturally, are much more suited to a place like Massachusetts, which is a very liberal blue state with certain exceptions. So I'm very comfortable where I am. I also think, I write about the Midwest and a lot because it's great to have perspective from a distance. I couldn't imagine writing about the Midwest intimately while living in it. I mean, great writers have done that. Faulkner did that. But I need perspective. I need distance, I think.
So I kind of have I don't know if it's a bad trait or a good trait, but I always end on kind of a large question. Uh, so here's your large question.
All right.
Uh, Farming plays an important role in the book and in Midwestern life. It's generally a landlocked occupation in the sense that one is in the world, but works the same portion for many years. Sports are more of a spectacle with teams traveling, players moving up levels, and thus changing home cities and where they live. Yet both take place outdoors in the dirt and grass. It could be said that both take place at home and the field stretching away from home. In the Beckoning World, Earl is given the opportunity of being a husband, but only with the stipulation that he takes up husbandry. Language provides a connection between the writer and the reader in play and in meaning. How do you edit toward this writer reader relationship through characters and their occupations?
Well, you're right. That's a large question. Um, and I have to say I don't instinctively think as philosophically as that when I'm working. I tend to just be so fully inside characters that I become them. And that's really not an intellectual place to be. It's an experiential place to be. So I would say I really don't in any conscious way think as theoretically as what you're very interestingly describing. Um, in the earlier part of your question, you were talking about the idea of farming being it's very obviously very important in the book, and so is baseball. And I think the two occupations, as I understand them and have participated in them, are actually very, very similar. That they both take place uh, on ground that has strictly measured borders and strictly measured boundaries. And it's the whole idea of precision and repetition that leads to the success of both occupations. Farming, you have to be absolutely precise as you plant and as you harvest. And the repetition of baseball is the whole goal is to be as exactly repetitive as you can possibly be, whether you're throwing a ball or trying to hit it. It almost becomes a kind of lovely monotony of task. So I think to me the two are very, very, very similar in their challenges and in their environments.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that. I think the cover of the book got me thinking about it because, right, we've got the plate up here and we've got the barn down here.
Yep, and I thought of that when you were posing your question. I'm thrilled about that cover, and I think that's exactly what it's talking about. And as the art director pointed out to me, the arrow or the home plate is pointing down, and the barn is pointing up. So
Yeah.
there's also that. That's kind
Well,
of relevant.
and the characters go on a barnstorming tour, right?
They do
But
indeed.
I
Which
don't know. I think this love with language that made me ask a question like this, where
oh, and my love is equal. So I love your question. I guess what I was trying to say is and I know for a fact a lot of fiction writers do approach the work and the art of fiction writing um, sort of more theoretically. That's really what their aim is, to make those very kind of connections of what language says about activity in just the way you pose the question. It's just, that's just not the way my mind works. Um, I think that I try to be characters. I don't try to, imagine who a character is. I try to be that character. And to me, that becomes a very visceral activity rather than an intellectual.
no, I love that. The different angles from which to come to a story, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my
Uh,
pleasure.
the Beckoning World is out in November on the
November,
University of
right.
Iowa Press. And of course, you have several other books that our viewers can check out.
Great.
Thank you again.
Thanks to you, Matthew.